most people live somewhere, and in communities across the UK, either now or in the very near future, there are concrete, real consequences of climate change which need to be prepared for. It's really obvious in places along the coastline, but when you start going into it, you find out that we're closer than one might think to serious problems with the water system, with the food system, food security, in an increasingly unstable world that is going to soon be beset by climate change in a way that could threaten to knock out several breadbaskets at the same time. A lot of communities could face food shortages potentially, right? And right now we have things like rising flood lines, we have flooding problems, we have, if rainfall patterns changed, which could potentially happen to a great deal. There are fires in places that never were fires before. If you change rainfall patterns in a place that is used to getting a lot of rain, what you get is a lot of very dry vegetation. All these things are real consequences of climate change, right? And that's part of the reason why a huge coalition of UK fire chiefs recently sent out a letter, signed a letter and made a public event out of promoting it, saying that essentially the UK needs a nationwide adaptation plan. And there are communities across the United Kingdom. Our campaign is about getting those communities and professions who are calling for an adaptation plan and who are already doing adaptation together in a coalition, together exchanging information and expertise between them, and together forcing the government to implement a national adaptation plan. And so that that campaign as a whole is called SAFER, which means Strategic Adaptation for Emergency Resilience. So adaptation is what we do when there are already effects of climate change. And the reason why that campaign is so exciting is that we recently passed the 1.5 degrees C barrier. So some people might know what that means. Essentially, we've gone over 1.5 degree Celsius increases in temperatures that scientists told us not to, that we've been warned is kind of a tipping point for an altogether different type of weather. So what that means is if you found the weather a bit freakish in recent decades, you haven't seen anything yet that was still in the normal zone that we weren't supposed to get out of, and we are now officially out of it, which means that adaptation to effects which are already here is necessary. And it's important in that as we enter that era for people who care about environmental progress as a whole to be involved in adaptation to help define the issue, right? The issue can't be we're going to adapt our way out of the consequences or out of the situation that we've gotten ourselves into. We can't just continue to keep on emitting because more emissions are going to mean things like the breakdown of the Atlantic currents that warm Britain. There's not really a way of fully adapting to that, right? So what we need is a adaptation campaign or a national adaptation push that is totally aware of that and sees adaptation as a step towards an overall strategic response that achieves resilience as a nation and as a world, right? So why is it that perhaps actually by saving their own arses, people across Britain might be doing the best thing they could do for the world's good? Well, because there's no message that a relatively small country that like Britain could send that's going to be more affecting than the world seeing on BBC World Britain's battening down the hatches in unison and having this national adaptation conversation. If suddenly this is really high profile, money is getting spent on it, there's very active, visible things done about it, and that spreads across to Europe, it'll spread quite a lot of other places. And if it spreads across the world, an adaptation concern, it also brings with it a lot of people going down the rabbit hole and seeing exactly what we're up against. So, and also the other thing is that we always have been asking since the beginning of climate action, gee, don't we need the whole world on side to get anywhere? And that's kind of immobilizes a lot of people, right? Well, an adaptation, you can make the next few decades of your own life much better by your own personal action, by your own community action, by your own national action. So in terms of building momentum in climate action, it's a total game changer. That's the way we approach it. A national adaptation plan would involve every community across the UK having its own adaptation plan, and those communities helping each other, and particularly if it's a national adaptation plan, the government providing coordinated support for every community to do its own adaptation plan. So we don't need to wait for the government, however. The campaign isn't about that. It's about helping those communities that are already taking the lead and doing adaptation to find each other, to help, to learn from each other, and to make their own efforts more visible. Right? So right now, adaptation is not super visible. There's a lot of communities across the UK that are already doing it, though. We're already thinking about how are we going to deal with rising floodwaters. We're already thinking about pollution of their own water systems. We're already thinking about how to deal with potential food shortages. And we have a lot of those together into a network already. And together, those are going to be the most effective groups to make adaptation more visible and to tell the government it needs to act, because they've been thinking about it and they are the climate majority. It's not the usual suspects, right? That's another great thing about that campaign, is that if you want to see an issue that appeals outside what we call the progressive bubble, the typical climate bubble, community level adaptation is it. It's a group of people that isn't the usual suspects. That'll probably break the mold as they call for a national adaptation plan. It becomes, what's important to notice about these community adaptation efforts, right, is that there's nothing that makes climate change more real than seeing things get done and seeing people like you, especially your neighbors, doing something about it. So if your friends and families and neighbors are actually doing adaptation, then immediately it takes on a different level of actual reality than most people have experienced so far.